Good afternoon, everyone. I think we have a few more people coming in from the break, but I think we can now get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this high-level session on trading in transition. Can security and sustainability coexist? My name is Carolyn Birkbeck. I'm the Executive Director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and SDGs, TESS, based here at the Geneva Graduate Institute, where we focus on promoting inclusive international cooperation on trade and sustainability. We're really delighted to be here at World Resources Forum 2025 and honoured to have the invitation to moderate today's discussion. So why does this session matter? We're here because of the huge and rising demand for minerals and metals that are the building blocks for solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and electric vehicles that are key to the clean energy transition. To stay on track with net zero targets, projections of the demand for critical minerals will triple by 2030 and quadruple by 2040. That's a huge scale up. So in good news, the fact that we're talking so much about critical minerals in the press, in capitals, in boardrooms, reflects the mounting efforts to meet net zero commitments. It also reflects the fact that action on decarbonisation will impact economic competitiveness and political security for years to come, and that trade, supply chains, and trade cooperation will have a key role in shaping sustainability, security, and development outcomes. So in today's session, our speakers will tackle the following question. Can global trade and supply chains in minerals critical for the clean energy transition be shaped to secure supply while advancing sustainability and inclusive development? And if so, how? So to set the scene for the discussion, I've been asked to take a few minutes to review the three, what I see at least, as the three interlinked themes for today's discussion: supply security, sustainability, and also development. So on supply security, governments and industries across the world are focused, as we know, on securing reliable supply or access to critical minerals for a range of reasons: political or national security goals, economic or commercial competitiveness, or to advance progress on net zero commitments. Alongside, companies active in the energy transition are keen to minimize risk and strengthen resilience across their supply chains. So the focus on security arises in particular because while critical minerals are globally distributed, resources and processing of many of these are highly concentrated in a few countries. So in these complex geopolitical times, we're seeing a range of trade and trade-related policies being deployed to maximize advantage, secure supply, including the use of a range of industrial policy tools, from subsidies to export controls, as well as trade and investment partnerships and alliances. So the second theme, sustainability. We know that critical minerals are often extracted in environmentally delicate and biodiversity-rich regions that can result in land disturbance, waste accumulation, and pollution. And this can affect mining communities and livelihoods, while at the same time, greenhouse gas-intensive mining and processing operations can further contribute to the climate crisis. So given the staggering scale of demand, resource efficiency, new technological innovations, and circular solutions will be essential to reducing reliance on further extraction and also easing environmental and social pressures. So alongside, there are pressures for mineral value chains to meet higher environmental, social, and governance standards. And we know that resource extraction in many parts of the world is associated with political risks, conflicts, and social tensions. So cooperation on trade has a vital role to play in ensuring and shaping the sustainability of those supply chains. A third dimension that we must consider today relates to development. For many resource-rich developing countries, the critical minerals boom could either drive structural economic transformation and sustainable development through local value addition, industrial development, growth of decent work and employment opportunities, and resource stewardship, or it could deepen dependency on raw material exports in ways that fail to deliver sustainable development. So trade policy choices and international cooperation on trade and investment will be decisive in shaping which future prevails. So I'm delighted today that we have a fantastic group of speakers to grapple with the question of this panel. They bring perspectives from science, from policy, and from business, and I'm really looking forward to their insights on the role of governance, on policy reform, transparency, and what industry collaboration can do for us. So from my far right, I'm pleased to introduce Anna Krutikov, who is the head of sustainable development at Glencore, one of the world's biggest and most diversified mining companies. Clovis Freire, who is the head of the Commodities branch at UNCTAD and Development. Colette van der Ven, who is the founder and director of TULIP Consulting, which is a consulting firm that advises governments and international institutions on legal and policy issues related to sustainable trade. And then finally, Vitor, who is the Secretary General of the International Raw Materials Observatory, INTRO. So thank you all so much for joining us today. So to get our conversation going, we're going to have 2 rounds of brief speaker interventions. The first for 5 minutes, the second for 3. And then I'm going to ask the speakers to comment on what each other has said, what they found insightful, if there's something they disagree with or something they'd like to build upon. And then each will have a rapid round of takeaway at the end on either a key message or recommendation they have. So as we're here in Switzerland, I brought along my Swiss bell to remind the speakers of the timing. I'm sure they'll all be efficient and I won't need to use it, but let that be the threat. So let's turn now to the first round of speaker interventions. The first questions that we have for the first panel are, what's changing in supply chains, in trade, and the trade policy landscape for critical minerals? And from your perspective, what are the key tensions, challenges, or priorities that we must really focus on? And then the second part of the question is around what solutions are gaining traction? What are some opportunities for more resilient, sustainable, transparent, and equitable supply chains? I'm sure that we will hear from the speakers on some of the complex geopolitical challenges that are at hand, but what we really want to focus on with this session is on the prospects for international cooperation and for boosting these sort of triple outcomes as previewed in the question. So with that, I'm going to turn first to Anna, and then I will sit down and we hopefully can have a good conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to address the audience. I'm not even going to pretend to answer all of that in 5 minutes. I won't even start. But maybe just to offer some reflections and just to preface what I wanted to share, we are a mining company, we're also a trading company. So we wear several hats most of the time. We're trying not to get too schizophrenic about it. But I think it allows us to have several different perspectives on some of these questions that I will try and address. So I think the first question, what's changed, or rather I should say, what is changing? I think we are in the midst of an incredible evolution. This time last year, in New York Climate Week in September, I listened to presentation after presentation from renewable energy companies talking about the bright future ahead of them and a world that was from an upstream supply chain perspective, pretty much risk-free. And when they were asked about, the raw materials that are required, particularly the minerals that are required to manufacture the solar panels or the wind turbines or the grid installations, they said, "Oh, it's not a problem. We'll just innovate, or we'll recycle, but mainly innovate." To where we are today, where critical minerals are, there's a headline a week in major publications, where there's a real focus for geopolitical reasons, for all of the reasons, Caroline, that you mentioned, the transition, the security of supply. Critical minerals are front and center of the conversation. So that's, I think, an unprecedentedly quick change that we've seen. I think we've also seen a lot of focus on the demand side in these value chains. So we've seen, just a couple of examples, the responsible sourcing standards introduced by the London Metals Exchange, work around some of the trading platforms being set up, conversations about potentially stockpiling in the EU and other jurisdictions, focus on processing capacity, etc. So very, very strong focus on what we see as the downstream, what we see as the demand signal. And we have seen that have an impact. We've seen that cascade upstream. We've seen awareness, recognition, understanding. I think there has been a challenge that, again, I think we're now starting to see also being recognized and addressed. And the challenge, I think, was for a minute there, we were going in a direction of a kind of a view of a world that focused on de-risking, on recognizing the challenges in some of these supply chains, but introducing regulatory instruments that would make it easier for our, for example, downstream customers to buy materials from safer jurisdictions, to say, look, we understand that this cobalt, comes from Congo, and we understand the role that responsible mining of cobalt plays in socioeconomic development in this country, but we would prefer it from Australia because it's just easier for us, and I can't fault them for it. But I think where we're coming to now with, for example, the Critical Raw Materials Act and some of the partnerships that have been announced there, we're starting to see a real investment of the downstream, of the regulators, of institutions in the upstream. And why do I think that's important? For obvious reasons in terms of kind of the security of supply, but also, and this is very much putting my mining hat on, sustainability is essential to security of supply. You cannot operate in a way that treads on communities' rights or destroys the environment with impunity over a period of time. It will invariably come back and impact your ability to operate. And so we need those collaborations. We need that investment in an engagement with the challenges that we see on the ground. There are systemic issues that we all know about where looking somewhere else is not going to help. It's not going to solve those problems. It's potentially going to make them worse. But I'm encouraged to see greater interest and steps towards that real on-the-ground collaboration. And that is very much where we find ourselves. And I know my time is ticking, but from a kind of trading perspective, our relationships with suppliers are very much geared towards building that long-term sustainability in supporting them in their growth, and also helping them improve safety practices, environmental practices, learning from others' experience to improve their own practice, but also make them more successful partners in trying to unpack some of these systemic issues that we see on the ground. I'll stop there before the bell goes off, if I didn't run out of time.
Oh, thank you very much, Anna. Really useful reflection on this shift in discourse towards how we manage the upstream of the clean energy transition. And in particular, I think you've highlighted some sort of growth of efforts to invest in regulatory cooperation, investment cooperation, and partnerships upstream to ensure that sustainability is central to those supply chains. So now over to you, Clovis, please. Same question is for everyone. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation for the UN Trade and Development to be here. I would like to start actually emphasizing that the way that we see in the United Nations Trade and Development is this issue of critical minerals is beyond mining. It's bigger than mining, and you have alluded to it. We know that this is related to a technological transition. This is beyond actually than a technological transition. It's a part of the technological revolutions of the past. And now you link minerals to the co-evolution of energy and technology, and to the same thing that oil was for the last century, right? So it's much bigger than mining. And with that, you also alluded to the geopolitical issues that are involved on that. And minerals are not only now commodities, they are, one could say, instruments of power. And that shifts a lot on how to deal with that. The questions become beyond economics of trade, of production. You have to take in consideration national security, strategy, and other things. So I just want to start to pose that particular element, that is what we are talking about is beyond mining. When you posed that question to us, you said you have the supply security, you have sustainability, and then you have the development. The way that we see, there are many challenges on supply security and sustainability. There's not easy issues to tackle. But in a way, those seems to have are issues that there are solutions to it. You can imagine solutions to those issues, right? But let me pose to something very difficult to tackle, is the developmental question. I know today we have in the world about 147 countries that we consider developing countries. Out of these 147, let's say, 95 are commodity dependent. 95. You know, it's a big number. That means that these countries rely over 60% of the exports on commodities, primary products. And they do not have any control of their own economy, right? When the price of the commodity goes up, everything goes well. When the price goes down, everything goes bad. So that problem we have not been able to solve yet. And there's a very difficult problem. And with the situation that I just mentioned with geopolitical issues related to commodities, that makes commodity dependence even a harder issue, because countries that are producers of those minerals, they are really incentivized to be focused only on doing that, right? So the way to get out of that situation is to help these countries diversify their economies, add value and diversify, not only export more commodities. And I would say that that solution also solves this issue. You know, why you have a supply problem? Because you mentioned you have concentration. How you solve concentration? Diversifying the nodes in this network. How to solve the sustainability? Adding capacity of these countries to deal with issues, and they add their capacity by building productive capacity, by being able to do more things. So I would like to just put this thought that the answer to that could be a yes, we can do that. We can have supply security with sustainability if we embed development into the solution, and that means value addition and diversification in the countries that produce these minerals.
Thank you so much, Clovis. I was just writing down a summary of what you said, and you summarized it yourself, is that if we can achieve this coexistence, if we embed development at the heart of what we're aiming to do with critical mineral supply chains. And thank you also for underlining just how commodity dependent so many developing countries are, and how central diversification will be for those countries. So now I'm going to turn to Colette, please.
Thank you, Caroline. Hi, everyone. I want to actually start where you left off, Clovis, and talk about a key element in your question, Caroline, which was, what tensions do we see? And I think there's two key tensions. One is the tension between commodity-dependent or commodity-exporting countries versus commodity-importing countries. And the second one is the tension, I think, which still is there, between accessing the raw materials and the sustainability. And I'll just unpack both of those a little bit. So on the first tension, you have on the commodity exporting country very much the interest that they do not perpetuate being a commodity dependent country and a research extractive country, like you were already mentioning, right? And to identify value addition, raw material beneficiation, and ways for those countries to really enter into a higher economic value chains and opportunities. So there is very much that interest. And so within the whole scramble for critical raw materials, those countries are very much saying, we want to make sure that we process some of those materials in our country for jobs, everything, what have you. And as a result, on the trade side, you see that accompanied by export restrictions, right? If you can no longer export, then there is a requirement to then having to process, or a nudge to processing that domestically. So that's very much what's happening on the resource exporting side. Now turning to the resource, or the resource importing side, like the countries that are really dependent on critical raw materials for their clean energy transition, like you mentioned, and defense and other things, the interests are very much about accessing the raw materials at a fair market price, right? And having guarantee and security of having that access. So market diversification is happening quite a bit in light of the recent geopolitical developments, but also very much an emphasis on how can I use different instruments, free trade agreements, partnership agreements, MOUs, what have you, to secure that access to those raw materials. And their beneficiation of local value chains isn't necessarily a priority, especially given that many importing countries are also seeking to increase the processing domestically, right? Like the EU is a case in point with their Critical Raw Materials Act. So there is a tension there. There's the second tension, which is one between the access and I think also the sustainability. Even though I very much appreciated your comments that businesses are all aligned here, and I think that might also be part of where to take things by the private sector pushing, I think there is still a bit of a tension here. And you see that very much when you're unpacking, for example, different free trade agreements and other instruments. If you take critical raw material chapters in, say, EU FTAs, you see language very much focused on accessing the materials on market rates, so prohibitions on dual pricing, prohibitions on monopolies, and things like that. When you look at the sustainability provisions in those agreements, they're not similarly binding. They are much more vague, much more wishy-washy, and many of them are not subject to dispute settlement. So there you see a little bit of that hierarchy in some of those policies, and similarly, a lot of the sustainability provisions or objectives of engaging with resource-rich countries are set out typically in non-binding instruments like MOUs. And those are, not just the EU doing that, there's a lot of different countries that are engaging in that, but they're not enforceable. So there is a bit of these tensions that you can see in the policy that governs these frameworks. How does one solve this? I guess that's a question that we're all here to try to figure out. There's no easy answers. There are, however, some interesting examples of countries trying to carve out a bit more policy space in the negotiations between resource exporting and resource importing countries. For example, Chile has managed to carve out a bit of policy space for lithium dual pricing in their FTA with the EU, and there's some other examples. So there's a number of different ways in which this could be addressed, and I'll stop here and we'll address a few more things at the second round. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Colette, and also for moving us further towards some of the trade politics that will be underlying whatever kind of cooperative solutions come forward, and also for highlighting that there are, I think you took us a little bit back to Anna's comments, that there are practical efforts also that companies and governments are trying to implement on the ground to promote sustainability efforts. So part of our job is to work out what kind of policy frameworks enable and support the kind of investments being made. So I'm going to turn, I think that might be a nice segue into Vitor's comments. Over to you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Carolyn. Well, my perception, if I may, by identifying the problem that you mentioned, is that what we are seeing now is the end of the liberal order. That's clear for everybody. And at the same time, the rise of nationalism. And that creates new tensions, because one of the problems that comes with it is that the soft power that we had before is being replaced by hard power. As Anna was mentioning, I believe a couple of years ago, some people might think
I think you're...
my sound is not good. Is it working?
Just hang on one second. Sorry,
Okay.
Vitor.
Is it working now?
No, I don't think at the back. Please bear with us for just a minute.
Inside, is it working now?
Yes.
There is a button here saying on and off. I don't know why it was off. So I was starting by saying that
Because you started talking about hard
yeah. So the problem, as I see it, is the end of the liberal order, which is being replaced by the rise of nationalism. And with the rise of nationalism, we are also seeing that soft power is being replaced by hard power. So standards and regulations that we normally had in place, apparently they are not so relevant as they used to be. And a couple of years ago, some people, especially in the mining sector, if we are telling them about that possible scenario with the energy transition, the demand for raw materials, critical raw materials, they will say, oh, wow, that's good. This is good news. But it's not necessarily like that, because if you talk with the mining industry, they will tell you that they are not making money. They are losing money, most of them, with the exception perhaps of gold. And the reason why is that these critical raw materials, we are talking about small amounts, small markets that can be manipulated. And because these markets are prone to manipulation, then investors are not putting their money there, because look to lithium, the lithium price had a fall of almost 10 times in 2 years. So if you put your money in lithium projects, you probably are losing a lot of money. So it doesn't make sense. So we need to change, and of course, if I may just, and this is happening because of instability. Because if you go and if you talk to miners, they will tell, where do you put your money? Probably they will go to gold projects and not to critical raw materials projects. Again, because of instability. That's one problem. The other problem, and the connection with the replacement of soft power by hard power, I have a story back from a few years ago when I was at the European Federation of Geologists, and in 2015, the European Commission was discussing the implementation of the so-called Conflict Minerals Directive. And we were lobbying in favor of that directive to block the trade of conflict minerals, of minerals from conflict areas. A few months after the approval of the directive, I visit the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, by the way, is a huge country. It's half the size of the European Union, and realized that the approval of that directive had negative impacts on the people, on the livelihoods of some of families. We have seen in the morning a speaker, one of the key speakers I was blessing, she was talking about artisanal small-scale mining and how important that is for communities. So what I've seen there is that the buyers, first the Americans left the DRC market because of the Dodd-Frank Act, then the Europeans left the DRC market because of the conflict directive, of the conflict minerals directive. The only ones who stayed were the Chinese and the Lebanese. And you know that you have this Marshall cross, demand and offer, meaning that with less offer, the prices fall. So, meaning that the Chinese were there and they were benefiting from the exit of the Europeans, because they were basically, the artisanal miners were making 5 or 6 times less money. They were making less than $20 per day as a family, when before they were making like $30 or $40. So the impact of the regulation on the people, on the communities, was sort of unexpected. So using this, I will call soft approach with standards, it's not always useful, because what we are making, especially if we are developing these things away from the implementation, from the reality, the field reality, what we are making is poor people will be poorer, and just creating bigger and larger divides. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, that's another hard problem that you put on the table there, and thank you really for underlining the social dimensions of this issue and how we can ensure that, I guess, the good intentions behind many of these different soft standards and regulations actually are reached on the ground, and what kind of approaches that may require. So look, I think we've heard so far some good analysis of the problems, the state of play, and where some of the opportunities may lie, and what we would need to do in order to promote a coexistence of security and sustainability, including through a focus on the development dimension. What I really like to shift to now is a focus on where trade cooperation can help. What could we do differently? What can leading companies in supply chains do? What can governments do to support that effort? How can we address some of the tensions, Vitor, that you have set out, and also that Colette you put on the table? I think for Clovis, you always said with the $1 million question is, how can we support countries in this diversification to move beyond mining? But these are your challenge now, is where to next? I think we need to get a little beyond the headlines of all the tension in this space and work out what are some ways forward. So I'm going to start over with Anna and then go backwards along the line again.
Thanks. It is $1 million question. I don't have the answer, but maybe just a few thoughts and reactions to some of the other comments. And maybe just taking actually the DRC as a kind of perfect example. Glencore does have operations in the DRC, not in gold. We have copper and cobalt mines in the Clovis area. So just reflecting on kind of what we see in practice, I totally agree that the kind of blunt regulatory instruments of things like the various conflict minerals regulation, we saw the increases in criminality in the eastern part of the DRC. We've seen the simmering and now tragically escalating conflict, well, hopefully less now, but we've seen that the regulation has not had perhaps the desired effect, and perhaps in some areas had kind of the opposite effect. We see now focus on investments in mines. There's talk from the EU, there's talk from the US in kind of real whether mostly equity or some kind of financial instruments being applied into the actual mineral supply chains. We hear talk about a sort of value add in country, the beneficiation, creating processing capacity in some of these countries. But if I look at the reality on the ground, and this is where I think there's a real opportunity, I think what's often being missed is the whole of system view. The DRC is a huge country with an enormous amount of complexity. One of the big challenges that we see in the area where we operate, and this is a challenge for every company you speak to there, regardless of nationality, is power. It's not the processing capability. It's simply power, having enough power to run operations. In some other areas, it's people, having sufficiently skilled local population to be able to run what are highly complex industrial operations. And so I think what we're seeing right now is a very strong focus on the supply chains themselves, the mine, the processing facility, maybe the sort of transport links between them, but very, very little. Whereas where I think we can have the opportunities to actually look at the system as a whole and to say what are the infrastructure challenges, but even more, perhaps even, looking at it with my sustainability hats on, what are some of the systemic challenges? And this is where I think it's something that we're very engaged in, and we hope to see more of this collaboration with other operators on the ground, again, irrespective of nationality, but these systemic challenges affect all of us, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's poverty, whether it's governance. And then bringing in other partners from the regulatory sphere and from the value chains to help to think collectively about what are the sort of the hard and maybe the more kind of systemic challenges that prevent these value chains from being truly successful, and looking at how we can bring in, whether it's different finance instruments, different trade instruments, different policies, to unlock the different pieces of the puzzle. Easier said than done, but you asked the question.
Oh, thank you very much, Anna. I'm sure that Clovis, you have points to raise on that. I like the idea of the systems approach. Over to you, Clovis.
Yes, I will start with that, actually. I totally agree. I think it's more systemic, it's bigger than that. And when we talk about, for example, diversification, validation, usually we think about processing, right? We add processing in these producing countries, but it has to be beyond processing, of course. When we think about diversification, it's throughout the value chain, moving forward, but backwards linkers, equipment for the mining, uniforms, everything. And also beyond the value chain, because the productive capacities to start to produce something may be used to produce something else, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, many other things. So that's what I think it's important for us to have in mind when we think about the diversification and validation. It's really beyond processing. And how trade and the trade system can help that. So trade systems, let's consider for working definition for us here is institutions, rules, regulations, the way that we operate in the trade system. I would say that if we are able to embed in the trade rules, regulations, systems, mechanisms, this idea that the end goal is development, all these instruments can be used to it. You know, it's not let's go for bilateral partnerships or multilateral partnerships or regional agreements, or it's not a either or, right? It's really all of them have a place and can be used if we have the end goal as development. For example, regional agreements, they can be used to help countries can pool their resources to diversify, to add value, but also to have additional demand from themselves, you know. So that can be used to that. So each one can be used to that one. And I think that what is important to shift this to development is to move from this us and them approach, you know, producer country, important country. When you start to diversify and so on, a country that exports cobalt may have to import lithium and graphite. And then the country is not only more export country, now it's an import country as well. So, you know, this line between importer and exporter will blur when you start to have countries that are able to produce more things, more countries that are able to produce things. And the more industrialized countries would also find opportunities and partnerships in other areas, you know, transfer of technology beyond mining. So I think those are the things that we have to have in mind when we think about the trade system.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I mean, very much linked. It's interesting, you started by saying beyond mining, now we're beyond processing, but I think it links with this idea of a systems approach and the idea that we would need to perhaps not see critical minerals so much as a standalone headline issue, but as part of a broader sector embedded in wider economies, focused on trying to achieve broader social ends, whether it's a net zero transition or its development. So in a way, we need to step back a bit from this. I think it's become super trendy to talk about critical minerals in isolation, right? So drawing from what you said, that would be a useful reflection, I think, and it sounds like that's a reflection that businesses and many policymakers in resource-rich countries are already trying to push toward. So over to you, Colette. What can we do on trade cooperation?
Thank you, Caroline. I think there's a number of multilateral initiatives, of course, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with or working on, including Clovis, in the space. I'm not going to talk about those because there might be, you know, pros and cons of developing those in today's very fragmented world. But at the same time, and in line of also what you were saying, Clovis, of, you know, the aggregate approach that all different instruments need to be applied at the same time towards pushing for a goal. I think there's a lot of room more immediate in the bilateral and regional space. If we're talking, going back, for example, to free trade agreements, which is still very much a key instrument in securing access to those critical raw materials, we heard about the difficulty of not just beneficiation, but say lack of power, right, in developing some of those, or in processing minerals, but also things like lack of transport. I think DRC only has 5% of paved roads, right? So there are these realities on the ground that means that if those minerals really will be developed in those mineral exporting countries, it requires an enormous amount of investment. So one way where I think there's a lot of scope for change is that trade agreements come more frequently aligned with a financial package, an investment element to it, and really a more comprehensive approach that says, we understand that to do this, you need the financing, right? That approach also would enable for, or would allow for the two partners in a trade agreement to take some of the burden of the sustainability, because it's costly very often, right? And that burden shouldn't be exclusively on the commodity exporting country. So that is, I think, one area where there's a lot of room for scope of aligning the different dots. You see some examples of this. For instance, and I'm going to look at some examples of the EU again, but they have this new partnership agreement called CTIPS, Clean Trade and Investment Partnerships, which is part of the Clean Industrial Deal, where the EU is very much trying indeed to link the global gateway funding to some of the other interests of free trade and accessing critical raw materials, and at the same time making sure that the interests of partner countries are taken into account and further developed. So I think that is another really interesting and important angle that needs to be further developed. I think in addition, what's really important is not to overlook the circular economy and the principles of the circular economy writ large. So yes, we need more and more critical raw materials to secure energy transition needs, defense, and other things. Caroline mentioned the numbers in the beginning, but at the same time, there's also a lot of space towards changing the way that our economies operate, so that we can be more efficient with the material usage that we have, whereby we ultimately reduce some of the material dependency ultimately. So that, I think, is also another really important element to not lose sight of. And then finally, on the side of the World Trade Organization, right here across the road, a lot of the instruments that countries are resorting to in this landscape of critical raw materials are export restrictions and bans and things like that. And though they don't always align with the rule book. So it also, I think, invites a discussion on where and how the multilateral system can play a more supportive role of some of these tensions that we've seen.
Thank you very much, Colette, and also for bringing clearly again the investment dimension in, that it's not really trade policy alone that we need to be looking at, but its relationship with investment partnerships and initiatives as well. So I'm going to turn to you, Vitor, and just a reminder to each that you're going to have to find at least one thing that you're provoked by in what others said on the panel, or that you just think is outright wrong, or it's been very amiable so far, but then, or there are things that you think we can build on further. So over to you, Vitor.
Thanks a lot, Carolyn. I fully agree with Clovis and Colette on the approach that they advanced. However, I believe we have one constraint now, and this is a divided world, a fragmented world. So the implementation might be difficult when compared with, let's say, the approach that we might have 1 decade ago. And that means that if you want to co-develop or co-invest in some countries, probably you will be choosing countries that are aligned with the same political or with the same cultural framework, meaning that it might be easier for Europeans to connect with Australia than it will be to connect with, let's say, some Asian country. And that, in a way, brings a new dimension, because then what you used to have in the past is this coupling between developed nations and resource-rich nations. For instance, Australia was providing Japan, after Japan, South Korea, after South Korea, now China, and that might be broken, meaning that that system that existed before, another example is Canada and the United States, it might be broken these days, because Canadians, I mean, the relationships they had with US is now different because of those political stress. In that landscape, I believe the challenge is to look to short-term solutions, because the solutions that you were pointing, these are long-term views, long-term approaches, and this is not really linked to reality. The links to reality is, let's go there using this MAGA mentality or Trump mentality. Let's go there, make a business, and fly away. And if Europe is competing in that world, we'll be losing, because we are the ones advancing the Gateway Initiative, all these long-term commitment to responsible development, inclusive, etc., United Nations, if you want, umbrella, and it doesn't work. Because China is using a different game, and now the Americans are also using a different game. So where do we stand? I believe this is the challenge. And I'm afraid I don't have any solutions. I'm the negative guy in the panel, I realize. I'm the pessimistic.
No, but it's good on the reality check. I was going to just step back before I ask you to react again to each other, is that, and I guess my reality check, at the beginning, I referred to this enormous scale-up that's required, tripling by 2030.
Yeah.
It's 4 years away. We've got a huge scale of environmental and social challenges in many of the countries where these resources will come from, not just linked to the mining itself, but to the wider economic structure and situation. We've got enormous economic and commercial opportunities at hand. That's true. We've got many companies willing and interested in responsible sourcing, many consumers interested in that, value chain actors interested in that. But we've also got these massive geopolitical tensions. So I'm trying to imagine myself being a cynic in this crowd saying, honestly, these guys are so idealistic about what's really possible in this context. I mean, the challenges before us, can we do this in tandem, security, sustainability, and development? But there are real short-term trade-offs and challenges at hand. So maybe just to keep that in mind while you're also reflecting. I'm very happy for positive stories as well. If you think there are things to build on from each other's remarks, please highlight those, but also highlight where you think there may be some divergence or things that we just continue to need to think harder about how to make those happen. So I might just go in a different order and start with Colette.
Sure, thank you. So actually, let me just reflect on what Clovis was saying. I really do agree with that, actually. Sorry, Caroline. But, and I understand the reality. I think where there would be an opportunity there, and let me be the positive person here, is that as especially, say, a place like the African continent, right, they're getting request after request from the Indians, the Chinese, the Americans, the Europeans, and beyond, right, about I want access to this and this and this. And I think that puts them in a very good negotiating position, right, to say, here is my bottom line, this is what I want, and this is what I want to get from you in order to make the deal. And I think that is an area where we do see a possibility to have sustainability be something that could be giving a leg up in that negotiation process if that's being offered by one of the trading partners, say the EU, right? Or even, I was in India just a few weeks ago, and I was asking them about their critical raw material strategies, and they also have one, and they're also in Africa, and they're also trying to get all kinds of things going. And I asked them, what are you offering to those countries? And they said, well, we've got a huge market. We're India, right? So I think in that regard, finding where your advantage lies as a potential partner in these negotiations, and finding a way to align it with the interest of the country from whom you're trying to source the materials could really, I think, also be aligned with some of the sustainability. I mean, we heard about the importance of that also for business, of doing this sustainably. And I think in particular for some of the countries with the minerals, this is really key. So there, I think there is an opportunity. That opportunity, however, is contingent upon the mineral-rich countries having a strategy of this is what we want, and that is often lacking. A strategy that often needs to be not national but regional, because not every country is well positioned to develop and have value addition for different raw materials. And I think that is an area which doesn't receive enough attention, that really needs to be a very important part of this conversation as we try to find ways to link trade and sustainable development with the scramble for critical raw materials. Thanks.
Thank you, Colette. I may jump across to Anna.
Okay. Maybe I want to build on that, and I'm just kind of looking at it very, very pragmatically. Forgive me, not from a policy perspective, but I'm just reflecting on kind of what we're seeing actually happening on the ground. And I don't want to kind of paint everything with an overly positive brush. I hear the negativity, and we certainly see a lot of that. But I think there's some really interesting developments, and I'm always very conscious in these conversations that we don't get into the practice of reinventing the wheel. There is a lot already happening. We have, and whether it's good or bad, time will tell, but we see these developments. We're seeing, if you kind of look back to, when Indonesia was one of the first resource-rich countries banning the export of raw nickel, we saw how that maybe has resulted in some, poor environmental practices proliferating in the country. We're now seeing the country try and kind of look at that and take steps to introduce new environmental requirements and limitations on where companies can operate. Is it perfect? No, absolutely not. And I don't want to kind of say, oh, look, it's all solved and everything, there will never be a problem. It's not at all perfect. But I think when we look at the reality on the ground, the DRC has banned the exports of cobalt, to I think an earlier point about countries, resource-rich countries being able to have a say in their destiny. That is the DRC saying, we need to have a greater say in the price of this commodity. What will the new system look like once the ban, if and when the ban is lifted? again, we don't have a 100% guarantee of success on any of these instruments, but we do have the reality of practice on the ground happening today. And we do see, and this is very much from both as a trader and a miner, we see companies on the ground of any nationality, Chinese, Indian, European, South American, who recognize the importance of, whether it's addressing the challenges of artisanal mining in the DRC, because of a deep commitment to human rights, or because it's a security challenge, or because it's a threat to market. There's a spectrum of issues, and again, it's a very, very wide and varied world there. But there is an interest in engaging on those topics. The conversations that we're having with our suppliers and the opportunities around the kind of the longer-term relationships, where they're saying, look, we want to have safety systems at our installations, we are cash constrained. What can we do? How can we work together to address that? So I think there is a will, I think there are things happening that we can look at and learn from and build on, but also think very pragmatically. And that was my last kind of point about, yes, these instruments are important and probably irreplaceable, but then there's always, for me, there's also always a question of how. The limitations around export, great. Once, how do you enforce them? Are there functioning traceability systems in place? Again, probably something that we can build on. You can talk about embedding sustainability requirements into these instruments. Completely understand the utility of that. But then, we need to think about the standards that we expect, and we need to think about what is out there, what are some of the efforts around standards that we can leverage to build the system. To your point, Caroline, we don't have a lot of time. So that also means we don't have a lot of time to kind of start from scratch or press the reset button. We need to critically examine what we have in front of us, both the positive and the negative, and see what we can build together. Again, for me, very much from that whole of systems perspective.
Excellent. Thank you, Anna. I'll turn now to Clovis, and then to Vitor. And then I think we started 10 minutes late, so that everyone's going to have a 1-minute takeaway. Over to you, Vitor.
Clovis.
Clovis first. Yeah, sorry.
To react, right?
Yes.
So I think very quickly, I totally see the point, Victor, that you made. Actually, it's very bleak future that you, or present that you just present to us, right? Is really the short term, the long term becomes very difficult to deal with. But I agree with Colette with the idea that there are opportunities there. You should not waste a crisis, right? You're not to let waste. So there are opportunities there, and resource-producing countries, they can understand, if they understand that, they can make something out of it. As Anna was saying, there are also ways to bring sustainability, the different companies, and how to deal with that. I think what I would like to add is that what I believe is very important is for the countries, developing countries, that are in the position to be producers of these minerals, they should really take that, take the control of that process, and they should pursue this diversification, this development. As again, I'm repeating myself, but beyond the mining. So it's not a mining strategy, it's not a critical mineral strategy, it's a development strategy of the country that includes trade, industry, investment, infrastructure policies. So it's beyond that, relations with other countries and so on. So if we help countries to build their capacities, to understand how to go through this process, how to go about it, not only say you should diversify, they know that. You go to countries, they know that. But how to go about it? Where we start. If we go to countries, help them to develop that and to understand that process, I think that will be a great help. In UNCTAD, we have a project now in 3 countries in Africa, Zambia, Namibia, and Madagascar, that we are doing exactly that. We are going to the countries and saying, look at their value chain, say where they can further add value within and beyond their value chain of critical minerals. What are the new products? And we identify in Zambia, for example, 95,000 $1 million opportunity in things related to, for example, chemicals and articles of copper, things like that, you know, and beyond the value chain of minerals. And if they understand what are there, and then can see what they should do in terms of policy to make that happen. So that is one way an example how to go about it.
Thank you, Clovis. And then Vitor, something optimistic, a way forward for us.
No, okay, something optimistic. I fully agree that mining should be sold as a sort of seed for development. I believe this is the way forward. So we should approach these countries that are mineral rich, telling them mining can be a seed for development, and then work with them to decide what do you want to do. Right. Sometimes I'm aware that these expectations are not realistic. For instance, you cannot have, let's say, a sophisticated battery plant in a country if the electrical grid, the electrical power is unstable. And sometimes these ideas might come up. But if you show that mining can be a seed for development, I believe this is the way forward. However, we need to align the expectations of the buyers, so the developed countries, with the capacity of the mineral-rich countries. And sometimes there is a gap there. I remember from the European Union, in the agreement made with Namibia, Namibia is very interested in hydrogen power. And the European Union is very interested in raw materials. So there is a clear mismatch there. And they have been working for 2 years trying to align that. And it isn't working because of the initial mismatch. So we really need to work, but on, let's say, realistic basis. I believe this is the way forward. And without that, we are just left to this transactional short-term approach, which, of course, it's not the best.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vitor. So we have 30 seconds each for the one takeaway. You have what you would have these audience here today take away as one area where they could invest energy or further that we need to work more collaboratively together on. It could be around traceability, building on what's already working. As Anna, you have said, what are some concrete things that could be taken forward? I might start with Vitor. I mean, you've already talked a lot about the policy agenda going forward in countries, but maybe give us your one takeaway or recommendation.
You mean Clovis?
Sorry, Clovis. I think it's because you both have the Portuguese, no?
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry. Over to you, Clovis. Sorry.
So if I want to suggest a takeaway, is really to critical minerals are really beyond the transition. We should consider beyond the transition of energy. It's a transition that is bigger than that. It's a technological transition that will change how people work, how people interact with each other, how institutions happen. So that's why it's such a big topic. And as such should be seen as beyond the purview of the mining minister and the trade on minerals. We are talking about trade in different areas, in different aspects. So let's have that perspective beyond mining and to development and embed development on how we deal with critical minerals.
Thank you. Clovis, I can see Anna nodding, so over to you for your takeaway or recommendation.
I might sneak in too.
Yes.
I think something that we've sort of talked through in this session around thinking about the system as a whole, whether it's geographic, whether it's structural, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's development, but looking at the system and thinking about where are the levers that we can push to unlock change and to catalyze development. I think that's really critical, and that's what's so often overlooked. But then maybe a little bit on the flip side of that, I just want to reiterate that we don't need to reinvent this wheel. We need to build, we need to harmonize, we need to take a holistic view and understand what are the gaps, both in terms of policy, but also in terms of execution. But what we should absolutely not do is kind of presume a starting point of a blank space. There is a huge amount of work at every level, from policy all the way to the ground, that is already being done, and we would do ourselves an enormous disservice if we disregard that.
Thank you very much, Anna. Over to you, Vitor.
Me?
Yes, your one takeaway.
Okay, just checking.
And then Colette does.
Okay, I do believe that I was thinking on your challenge. I remember that an Indian economist that was negotiating the access to the European market like 2 decades ago, he was basically telling the Europeans that it was unrealistic to ask India to follow the same standards and have the same capacity to provide materials that were built basically using the European approach on environment and social dimensions, etc. And he was saying that if you force us to do that, you are basically condemning India to be in the medieval times forever. Because you cannot look, if you look inside, inward to Europe, you see that you have developed in the times, for instance, of the Industrial Revolution, we were also using child labor. We didn't pay attention to environment. So we want to fast forward 200 years, and now we are asking developing countries to behave, have that jump immediately, and to be as developed as we are. So that was the question. I'm not basically endorsing these views, but it's important to realize that if we want to have cooperation with developing countries, we also need to be, let's say, to have some flexibility to accommodate their realities, which are not always the same. And this is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vitor. And Colette, you have the last word on this part.
Thank you, Caroline. I would say my takeaway would be the importance of aligning or finding ways to align interests. I mean, we've heard perspectives from the policy world, the private sector, different approaches, the skeptical one, the positive one. But where can we see and map where the interests are and how those could be aligned and which actors can be engaged to push for similar interests? There are overlaps in interest between resource producing, resource importing countries, business, policy, development. There are overlaps. Can we map those? Can we find ways in which each stakeholder can advance those interests? And where are the tensions that really are insurmountable? I think that exercise can use work without assuming perhaps from a high level perspective where the interests are. Because I think in particular in development, one would be surprising to see that also a lot of developing countries are keenly interested in going down a path of sustainable development aligned with their growth strategy. But so that would be my takeaway.
Thank you very much, Colette. So as our time is almost at a close, I'm just going to start to close this panel firstly by thanking or inviting all of you to thank our 4 speakers today, Anna, Colette, Clovis, and Vitor, for joining us, for sharing their thoughts. So let's first give an applause. Thank you. So, and just to wrap up, as time is short, I think the core point I've taken away is that not only do we have to find ways for supply security, sustainability, and development to coexist, but that there are opportunities to do so. There are lessons that we can build on from work that's already underway. We don't have a lot of time to reinvent the wheel. We have the urgent need to find ways to bolster short-term cooperation while also looking at the longer game. In looking both short-term and long-term, we have to see the mining sector and critical minerals in context of the wider economic systems and development strategies and pathways that countries have. We also need to think about some of the strategies that resource-rich countries themselves can use to advance their interests in these discussions and to work regionally. We can look to companies to look at some of the efforts that they're already undertaking, the standards that are already there, and how we can find ways to connect these better, to not reinvent the wheel, to not replicate. We need to move swiftly. So that's something that's important in this regard. I think one of the elements that I've heard here is the point of being mindful of the circumstances developing countries. You have highlighted a lot the realities of situations on the ground for many communities, in particular in the artisanal mining sector. There's a whole range of different policy tools that have been mentioned. I won't summarize all of those. But I think what we can do is see that there's a range of potential solutions and opportunities in this space. If we have committed stakeholders from across the system, if we work to bring the right set of actors together. I think, Anna, that's something that you have emphasized at the national level and regionally as well. So I would just like to close again by thanking you all for taking the time to be here. I hope you've all found it a fruitful discussion. And thank you again to the World Resources Forum for hosting this panel today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.